Adelina Roundtree stood frozen in the middle of the bridal chamber, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the man across the room could hear it. The candles had burned low, throwing long shadows across the silk curtains, and the door had just closed behind the last of the maids. She was alone with her husband, a man she had spoken to perhaps a dozen times before this morning. Julian Ashbourne, Duke of Camden, poured 2 glasses of wine, and did not look at her right away. He had the calm, unreadable face of a man who had learned long ago to hide whatever he felt. When he finally turned, his eyes moved over her with a kind of quiet assessment, not cruel, but distant, as though he were studying a painting rather than a bride. "You may sit," he said, gesturing to the chair near the fire. "There is no need to stand, as if you are waiting for a verdict." Adelina obeyed, smoothing her skirts with trembling fingers. She accepted the wine but did not drink it. Her mind was racing far ahead of the room they stood in, back to a house she had left behind that morning, back to hallways she had spent years trying to forget. "I know this marriage was not your choice," Julian said, setting his glass down. "It was not entirely mine either, but we are bound now, and I intend to be fair to you. I ask only the same in return." "You are kind to say so," Adelina answered carefully. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He studied her again, and this time something shifted in his expression, a flicker of curiosity breaking through the ice. "You look at me as though you expect me to strike you." The words landed harder than he could have known. Adelina's hand tightened around the stem of her glass.
"I look at everyone that way, Your Grace. It is simply my nature."
It was not the truth, not fully, but it was close enough that she did not have to lie outright. She had spent years learning how to answer questions without answering them, how to give just enough truth to satisfy without giving away the rest. Julian crossed the room slowly, the way a man might approach a nervous horse, and Adelina had to force herself not to flinch before he even reached her. He stopped an arm's length away and extended his hand, not to touch her, but simply to help her rise. "It grows late," he said. "I will not pretend that a marriage such as ours does not carry certain expectations, but I would rather earn your trust than take what has not been freely given." Adelina's breath caught. She had expected demands, not patience. She had expected the cold efficiency of duty, the kind she had steeled herself for, since the moment her father told her the marriage had been arranged. She had not expected a man who paused to ask. She rose from the chair, and for a moment, standing so close to him, she almost believed she could simply let the evening happen as it was meant to. But then his hand moved toward the ties at her shoulder, meaning only to help her from the heavy overdress, and something inside her snapped shut like a door slamming against a storm. She stepped back so quickly she nearly stumbled into the chair. "I am unwell," she said, the words tumbling out too fast, too sharp. "Forgive me. I cannot tonight." Julian's hand fell to his side. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence stretched painfully between them. Adelina kept her eyes on the floor, bracing herself for anger, for the kind of cold fury she had learned to recognize in the tightening of a jaw or the narrowing of eyes. She had seen that look before, on a face that had once been meant to love her. But when Julian spoke again, his voice held no anger at all. "Then we will not tonight," he said simply. She looked up, startled. "You are pale," he continued, studying her with a frown that seemed more concerned than offended. "Perhaps the day has simply been too much. Weddings are exhausting affairs, even for those who wanted them." Adelina did not correct him, though the truth had little to do with exhaustion. She murmured something about the excitement of the day, the strangeness of a new house, and he accepted it with a small nod, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, as if he sensed there was more beneath her words. "There is a chamber prepared for you across the hall," he said. "I will not intrude upon it unless you wish me to." It was, she realized, an offer of separate rooms, a kindness she had not expected from a stranger, bound to her by contract and family obligation. She thanked him quietly, gathered what remained of her composure, and allowed one of the household maids to lead her away. Alone in her new chamber, Adelina sank onto the edge of the bed and finally let herself breathe. Her hands were still shaking. She glanced toward the mirror across the room, catching sight of her own reflection in the candlelight, the high neckline of her nightgown, the long sleeves that covered her arms even in the warmth of summer. She had dressed this way for years, carefully, deliberately, until it no longer felt like a choice but simply a habit, as automatic as breathing. She thought of her father, who had signed the marriage contract with visible relief, as though he were finally putting down a burden he had carried too long. She thought of the stepmother, who had raised her after her own mother died, a woman whose smiles in public never matched the coldness behind closed doors. Adelina had learned early that some wounds did not need to be seen to be real, and that the ones which could be hidden beneath silk and lace were often the deepest. She had come into this marriage expecting nothing but survival, a new house, a new name, a husband who would likely never look twice beneath the surface of her carefully constructed calm. That was the arrangement she had prepared herself for. She had not prepared herself for a man who noticed when she flinched. Down the hall, Julian sat alone by the dying fire in his own chamber, turning his wine glass slowly in his hand without drinking from it. He was not a man given to sentiment, and he told himself the strange tightness in his chest was nothing more than the natural unease of a wedding night gone differently than expected. And yet he could not stop replaying the moment she had stepped back from him, the sheer panic that had flashed across her face before she smoothed it into something calmer. He had seen fear before. He had seen it in soldiers, in servants who expected punishment for small mistakes, in his own mother during the final years of his father's temper. He recognized it now in his new wife, though she had tried so carefully to disguise it as simple nerves. Julian was not a man who pried into matters that were not his business. He had built his reputation on discretion, on keeping his own affairs close, and expecting others to do the same. But something about the way Adelina Roundtree had looked at him, as though bracing for a blow that never came, settled into his mind and refused to leave. He told himself it was simply concern for the woman who now bore his name, nothing more. But as the fire burned low and the house settled into silence around him, Julian found himself thinking not of the marriage contract, or the heir his family expected, or the political alliance the union was meant to secure. He found himself thinking only of the fear in her eyes, and the quiet, careful way she had learned to hide it. Whatever secret his new wife carried beneath her silk and lace, he intended, in time, to understand it. Neither of them slept easily that night. In separate rooms, across a hallway that felt far wider than its actual distance, a duke and his new duchess lay awake with their own private thoughts, each aware that something unspoken had already begun to shift between them, though neither could yet name what it was. The marriage had begun as an obligation. Neither of them expected it to become anything more. Neither of them yet realized how wrong they were. 3 weeks into her marriage, Adelina had developed a routine so precise it could have been mistaken for a military schedule. She rose before the household staff, dressed herself without assistance whenever she could manage it, and made certain her sleeves were always buttoned tight at the wrist before she left her chamber. She had perfected the art of appearing perfectly ordinary, and she believed, for the most part, that she was succeeding. She did not know that her husband had begun to notice everything. Julian was not a man who spoke of his observations aloud, but he was a man who paid attention, and the longer he watched his new wife move through the halls of Camden House, the more small details gathered in his mind, like pieces of a puzzle he had not yet been given permission to solve. She never allowed the maids to help her dress. She wore long sleeves even during the warmest hours of the afternoon, when other ladies of the house had long since changed into lighter fabrics. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever a servant reached toward her without warning, even to hand her a cup of tea, and she never, not once, allowed herself to be touched on the arms, not by him, not by anyone. At first, Julian assumed simple modesty, the kind bred into many young women of good families. But modesty did not explain the way her eyes tracked every movement in a room, the way she positioned herself near doors rather than in the center of gatherings, the way she seemed to catalog every exit before she ever sat down to a meal. It was during a quiet dinner, 3 weeks and 4 days into the marriage, that Julian first began to see past the careful mask his wife wore so well. "You have not touched your soup," he observed, setting down his own spoon. "I am not overly fond of turtle soup," Adelina admitted, though I did not wish to offend the cook by saying so. "Then I shall tell the cook myself, and spare you the discomfort of pretending otherwise." A small, surprised laugh escaped her, before she could stop it, quickly followed by an expression of mild alarm, as though laughter itself were something she had not expected to allow herself. "You find that amusing?" Julian asked, genuinely curious now. "I find it unexpected," she admitted. "I did not think dukes concerned themselves with the preferences of their wives regarding soup." "This duke does," Julian said, and something in his tone was almost gentle. "I find I would rather know what pleases you than guess wrongly for the rest of our lives together." Adelina looked at him properly then, perhaps for the first time since the wedding, really looked at him, rather than simply enduring his presence. He was not what she had expected from the descriptions whispered among her father's acquaintances. They had spoken of him as cold, distant, a man hardened by the early loss of his first wife. What Adelina saw instead was a man who watched carefully, who chose his words with unusual precision, and who seemed, against all her expectations, genuinely interested in the answers he received. "I enjoy reading more than I enjoy soup of any kind," she offered, testing the waters of honesty with something small and safe. "What do you read?" "History, mostly. And whatever novels I can convince the lending library to part with, though my father always thought novels a waste of a young lady's attention." "Your father sounds like a man of limited imagination," Julian said, and though his tone remained light, something flickered behind his eyes at the mention of her father, some thought he did not share aloud. Their conversations continued in this manner over the following days, small exchanges over meals, brief moments in the library where Adelina found herself, almost against her own caution, drawn into discussions about the books scattered across the shelves. Julian discovered that his wife possessed a sharp wit she rarely allowed herself to display fully, and a mind quick enough to hold her own in debates about history and politics that most gentlemen assumed were beyond a woman's interest. He found himself, more than once, seeking out her company, simply because he wished to hear what she would say next. But for every step forward in conversation, there remained an invisible wall the moment physical closeness threatened to enter the space between them. If his hand brushed hers, reaching for the same book, she withdrew it, as though burned. If he stood too near while helping her into a carriage, her breath would catch, and her shoulders would stiffen, in a way that had nothing to do with the cold autumn air. Julian began to test these boundaries carefully, not to press against them, but to understand their shape. He noticed she tolerated brief contact at the elbow, guiding her through doorways, but recoiled instinctively from anything approaching her wrists or forearms. He noticed she would sit close to him by the fire in the evenings, close enough that their sleeves nearly touched, yet the moment he shifted as though to take her hand, she would find some reason to rise and busy herself elsewhere. It was not indifference. He was certain of that now. There was warmth in the way she looked at him when she believed he was not watching, curiosity in the questions she asked about his childhood, his interests, the running of the estate. She was not a woman who disliked him. She was a woman guarding something so carefully that even simple affection had become dangerous territory. The household staff, meanwhile, had their own opinions about the new Duchess, opinions they were careful to keep from Julian's ears, but not always careful enough. Adelina overheard, more than once, whispered comments about her strange habits, her unusual modesty, the way she startled at sudden movements, like a woman who had lived too long expecting harm. She learned to walk past such whispers with her chin raised and her expression unreadable, the same way she had learned to walk past worse in her father's house. But the whispers stung more than she wanted to admit, not because she feared judgment, but because she feared what such talk might eventually reach her husband's ears, and what questions he might begin to ask if it did. One evening, nearly a month into the marriage, Julian found her in the library long after the rest of the house had retired. She sat curled into a window seat with a book open on her lap, though her eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the glass, rather than the pages before her. "You are troubled," he said, not quite a question. Adelina startled slightly, then composed herself with practiced ease. "Merely thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, weighing how much of the truth she dared offer. "About how strange it is to build a life with someone you barely know. How strange it is that a stranger might come to know you better than the people who raised you." Julian moved closer, sitting at the far end of the window seat, careful to leave space between them. "I do not think it's strange at all. Familiarity does not always come from years spent together. Sometimes it comes from paying attention." You pay a great deal of attention, Adelina observed quietly. I have found you worth paying attention to. The words hung between them, simple and unguarded, and for a moment, Adelina forgot to maintain the distance she kept so carefully in place. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not judgment or suspicion, but something closer to genuine regard, the kind she had spent years believing she did not deserve. You should be careful, she said softly, almost to herself. There are parts of me that are not pleasant to know. I have not yet met a person without such parts, Julian replied. I do not expect you to be an exception. I only ask that you allow me the chance to know you fully, in your own time. I will not force what has not been offered freely. Adelina said nothing, but something in her posture eased, some small fraction of the guard she carried lowering, if only slightly, if only for that quiet hour in the library, with the fire burning low, and the rest of the world shut safely outside the door. She did not tell him her secrets that night. She was not ready, and he did not ask her to be. But as she returned to her chamber later, her steps felt lighter than they had in years, carrying with them the strange, unfamiliar warmth of being seen without yet being fully known, and somehow not being pushed away because of it. Neither of them could have guessed how soon that fragile trust would be tested, or how quickly the careful walls Adelina had built over so many years were about to come crashing down, not through her own choice, but through an accident neither of them could have foreseen. The smell of smoke reached Adelina before the sound of shouting did. She woke coughing, her eyes stinging in the darkness, and for a disoriented moment, she thought she was back in her father's house, back in the small cold room she had once called her own. Then the acrid smell sharpened, unmistakable and real, and she bolted upright to see a faint orange glow flickering beneath the gap of her chamber door. Fire. She was on her feet before her mind fully caught up with her body, grabbing a shawl from the chair and pressing it over her mouth as she reached for the door handle. The corridor beyond was thick with smoke, curling along the ceiling in dark ribbons, and somewhere down the hall she could hear the frantic shouts of servants and the sharp clang of someone striking a bell in warning. The east wing was burning. She could see the glow through the smoke, hear the crackle of flame consuming old wood and older tapestries, could feel the heat pressing against her skin, even from a distance. Adelina! Julian's voice cut through the chaos, and a moment later his hand closed around her arm, pulling her away from the smoke and toward the main staircase. She did not have time to flinch, did not have time to remember the careful distance she kept between herself and any unexpected touch. Survival overrode habit, and she let him guide her, coughing, down through the smoke-filled halls toward the cold night air outside. They made it as far as the second landing when a support beam gave way somewhere above them with a groan like a dying animal, and burning debris crashed down across the staircase ahead, blocking the direct path to the ground floor. Julian swore under his breath and pulled her back, redirecting them toward a servant's stairwell at the far end of the hall. The smoke grew thicker as they moved, and Adelina's chest burned with every breath. Her foot caught on the hem of her nightgown as they hurried down the narrow stairwell, and she stumbled hard against the wall, her vision swimming from the smoke and the impact. I have you, Julian said, and before she could protest, before old instinct could rise up and pull her away from his hands, he had lifted her fully into his arms, carrying her the rest of the way down, as the house groaned and cracked around them. They emerged into the courtyard together, gasping in the cold night air, surrounded by the chaos of servants forming bucket lines, and grooms leading panicked horses away from the stables. Julian set her down gently on the low stone wall bordering the garden, his own face streaked with soot, his breathing ragged from the smoke and the effort of carrying her. It was only then, in the flickering orange light of the burning east wing, that he noticed her sleeve had torn during the fall on the stairwell, the fabric ripped open along the seam from wrist to elbow, and it was only then that he saw what lay beneath. Faint lines crossed her forearm, pale and old, the kind of marks that did not come from accident or illness, but from something far more deliberate. They were healed now, silvered with age, but unmistakable in their pattern, too regular, too intentional to be anything but what they were. Adelina followed his gaze, and her entire body went rigid. She yanked her arm back with a gasp, pulling the torn fabric closed with shaking fingers, but the damage was already done. He had seen. There was no unseeing it now. Adelina, Julian said quietly, and the shock in his voice was not disgust, was not the horrified recoil she had braced herself for, through years of careful hiding. It was something closer to grief. "It is nothing," she said, too fast, her voice cracking on the words. "An old accident. It is nothing. Adelina." "Please." Her voice broke fully now, and she hated the sound of it, hated the tears that gathered, despite every effort to hold them back. "Please do not ask me tonight. Not tonight. I cannot." Julian's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly, understanding etched into every line of his soot-streaked face. He did not press further. Instead, he removed his own coat and settled it gently around her shoulders, covering the torn sleeve, covering the marks that had been hidden for so long, and said nothing more as they waited together in the cold for the fire to be brought under control. But something had shifted between them in that moment, something that could not be undone by silence or by the passage of time. Julian had seen, and Adelina knew that he had seen, and the careful architecture of secrecy she had spent years constructing had finally, irrevocably, begun to crack. The fire was contained before dawn, though the east wing was left a ruin of blackened stone and smoke-stained timber. No lives were lost, though 2 grooms suffered minor burns pulling horses from the stable, and the household spent the following days in the exhausted, unsettled aftermath that follows any disaster narrowly survived. Adelina retreated into herself in the days that followed, more guarded than she had been even in the earliest weeks of the marriage. She wore gloves now, even indoors, even at meals, a barrier so obvious that the household staff exchanged glances but said nothing, and Julian watched with growing concern but did not push. He was not idle, however. Whatever restraint kept him from questioning his wife directly did not extend to the quiet inquiries he began making on his own, inquiries conducted with the same careful discretion he applied to matters of state and estate business. He wrote to acquaintances who knew her father's household. He spoke, carefully and without revealing his purpose, to the driver who had transported Adelina's belongings on the day of the wedding, a man who had once worked in her father's stables and who remembered more than he perhaps should have said. What Julian learned in those quiet days sat heavy in his chest like a stone. Adelina's mother had died when she was young, and her father had remarried, within 2 years, to a woman named Lavinia, a widow with sharp features and a reputation, among those who knew the household well, for a temper that rarely showed itself in public. The driver spoke carefully, choosing his words with the caution of a man who feared repercussions for speaking at all. But the picture he painted was unmistakable. A young girl who had once been lively and outspoken had grown quiet over the years, more careful, more watchful, her laughter rarer with each passing season. Servants had come and gone from that household with troubled expressions and little explanation, and Adelina's father, weak-willed and easily managed by his new wife, had looked away from whatever occurred behind closed doors, rather than risk the peace of his own household. Nothing had ever been proven, nothing had ever been spoken of openly. It was the kind of quiet, hidden cruelty that thrived precisely because no one wished to look too closely, because a family's reputation mattered more, in the eyes of society, than the well-being of one quiet, watchful girl. Julian sat with this knowledge for 2 full days before he trusted himself to face his wife without the anger showing plainly on his features. He was not angry at her. He was angry on her behalf. A fury so complete it startled him with its intensity, directed at a stepmother he had never met and a father who had failed, in the most fundamental way, to protect his own daughter. But anger, he knew, would not help Adelina now. What she needed was patience and safety and the slow, careful proof that not every hand raised near her carried the threat of harm. He found her on the 3rd evening after the fire, sitting alone in the small drawing room that had survived the blaze, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes distant in a way that suggested her thoughts had traveled somewhere far from the present room. "May I sit with you?" he asked from the doorway, deliberately keeping his distance, deliberately making the choice hers to make. Adelina looked up, startled from her thoughts, and after a long moment, nodded. Julian crossed the room slowly and settled into the chair across from her rather than beside her. Another deliberate choice, another small offering of space. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and somewhere beyond the walls the household continued its quiet evening routines, unaware of the careful, fragile moment unfolding in the drawing room. "I am not going to ask you tonight," Julian said finally. "I promised you that, and I intend to keep the promise. But I want you to know that whatever I saw, whatever I might come to learn, changes nothing about how I regard you. You are not diminished in my eyes. If anything, I find myself in greater awe of the strength it must have taken to survive whatever you have survived, and to still sit across from me now with such composure." Adelina's composure cracked, just slightly, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "You do not know what you saw. I know enough to understand it was not an accident, however you wish to name it," Julian said gently. "And I know enough to understand that someone hurt you, badly, for a long time, and that you have carried the weight of hiding it ever since." A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek before she could stop it. She did not answer, could not seem to find the words, but she did not deny his gentle observation either, and in the silence between them, that absence of denial spoke more clearly than any confession could have. "I am not asking you to tell me everything tonight," Julian continued. "I am only asking you to know that when you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will listen without judgment, and I will not look at you differently for what was done to you. The shame of it was never yours to carry." Adelina looked at him then, really looked, searching his face for the falseness she had learned to expect from every kind word offered in her life. The falseness that always eventually revealed itself as manipulation or condition. She searched, and found nothing but steady, patient sincerity looking back at her. For the first time since the wedding, she did not feel the urge to retreat behind her careful walls. She felt, instead, the faint and unfamiliar beginning of something that might, in time, become trust. "Thank you," she whispered, and though the words were small, they carried the weight of a door easing open, just slightly, after years of being sealed shut. Julian did not press further that night. He simply remained in his chair by the fire, offering silent company rather than demands, and when Adelina finally rose to retire, he walked her to the door of her chamber and left her there without a single word about the marks beneath her sleeve, without a single question she was not yet ready to answer. But both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the truth had already begun its slow, careful journey into the light, and that neither of them could return fully to the careful distance of before. 2 weeks after the fire, a letter arrived at Camden House, bearing the seal of Adelina's father, and its contents shattered whatever fragile peace had settled over the household in the days since the drawing-room conversation. Adelina read the letter alone in her chamber, her hands trembling as she took in the careful, formal script. Her father wrote to inform her that Lavinia, her stepmother, intended to visit Camden House the following month, along with her father himself, to see how the new Duchess had settled into her marriage. The letter spoke of family duty and proper appearances, of the importance of maintaining relations between the two households now that the marriage had secured such an advantageous connection. Adelina set the letter down with fingers gone cold, her mind spinning back through years of memory she had worked so hard to seal away. The thought of Lavinia walking through these halls, smiling that careful public smile, while her eyes carried the same familiar warning they always had, threatened to undo every fragile step forward Adelina had taken since the wedding. She did not tell Julian immediately. She told herself she needed time to compose her response, to find some polite way to delay the visit, or refuse it altogether, without raising suspicion. But composure proved harder to find than she expected, and by the time Julian found her that evening, pale and distracted at dinner, pushing food around her plate without eating, he did not need to ask whether something was wrong. "What has happened?" he asked, setting down his own fork. Adelina hesitated only a moment, before sliding the letter across the table toward him. She had decided, somewhere in the quiet hours of the afternoon, that hiding things from him had cost her enough already. If she wanted the trust growing carefully between them to survive, she needed to offer honesty in return for the patience he had shown her. Julian read the letter in silence, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at her with a question in his eyes that he did not yet ask aloud, waiting instead for her to decide how much she wished to share. "My stepmother," Adelina said quietly, "was not a kind woman. Not to me. My father married her when I was 10 years old, and from the very first year, she made certain I understood my place in the household was smaller than I believed it to be." Julian remained silent, giving her the space to continue at her own pace. She never struck me where it would show, Adelina continued, her voice growing steadier as the words, so long held back, finally began to find their way out. She was careful about that. She understood which forms of punishment left marks that servants might notice, and which did not. And when punishment did leave marks, she made certain they were places easily covered by sleeves and gloves and high collars. "And your father?" Julian asked, his voice carefully controlled, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed the anger beneath the surface. "My father preferred not to see what was inconvenient to see," Adelina said, and the bitterness in her tone was old and worn smooth by years of repetition. He told himself Lavinia was strict but fair. He told himself my quietness was simply my nature, rather than something that had been carved into me over years of learning that speaking out only made things worse. The marks, she explained, had come during the worst years, between the ages of 12 and 16, before she had learned to become so quiet, so careful, so utterly unremarkable, that Lavinia's attention drifted elsewhere for lack of anything to provoke it. She spoke of small cruelties, disguised as discipline, of punishments that left no obvious bruises, but instead left the kind of marks she now hid beneath silk sleeves. She did not go into every detail, and Julian did not ask her to. What she offered was enough, more than enough, for him to understand the shape of the suffering she had carried alone for so many years. "I stopped fighting it eventually," Adelina admitted. "I learned that fighting only prolonged things. I learned to be small, to be quiet, to disappear as much as a person can disappear while still standing in a room. By the time my father arranged this marriage, I believe Lavinia was relieved to be rid of me, and I was relieved simply to be leaving that house, whatever waited for me here instead." Julian rose from his chair and crossed to her side of the table, and when he knelt beside her chair, taking her gloved hand gently in his own, Adelina did not pull away. "You will not see her," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Not if you do not wish to. This is your house now as much as mine, and I will not have anyone enter it who has caused you harm." "My father will be offended," Adelina said, though there was no real protest in her voice, only exhaustion. "Then let him be offended," Julian replied. "He offended a far greater debt against you long before this letter arrived, and he has done nothing in all these years to repay it." Tears gathered in Adelina's eyes, but for once they did not feel like tears of fear or shame. They felt, instead, like the release of something she had carried far too long, without anyone to share the weight. "I do not know how to simply say no to them," she admitted. "I have never been permitted to." "Then I will say it for you," Julian said. "You need only tell me what you wish, and I will handle the rest." Over the following days, Julian composed a careful, formal letter to Adelina's father, declining the proposed visit on the grounds of the recent fire and the ongoing repairs to the household, a polite excuse that offered no offense to be taken, while firmly closing the door on Lavinia's intended visit. It was not a permanent solution, but it bought time Adelina desperately needed to find her footing in this new life, before facing the ghosts of her old one. But the confrontation with the letter had opened something in Adelina that could not easily be closed again. Having spoken the truth aloud, even in careful, incomplete pieces, she found herself unable to return fully to the silence she had maintained for so long. In the days that followed, small fragments of her past continued to surface in quiet moments, over breakfast, during evening walks through the garden, in the hushed hour before sleep, when confessions came easier in the dark. She told him of a governess who had shown her small kindnesses in secret, slipping her extra bread when meals had been withheld as punishment, teaching her to read beyond what Lavinia thought proper for a girl being groomed into quiet obedience. She told him of the small rebellions she had allowed herself, hidden books read by candlelight, secret walks through the gardens at night when the house was finally silent. She told him, slowly and in careful pieces, about the girl she had been before the years of careful smallness had reshaped her into someone else entirely. Julian listened to every word without judgment, without the horrified pity she had feared for so long, offering instead a steady, patient presence that asked nothing of her, except her own comfort in the telling. "I am not the same person I might have been," Adelina said one evening, sitting beside him on a garden bench, as the last light of day faded into dusk. "I do not know how to be anything other than careful." "Then we will learn together," Julian said simply. There is no need to become someone else entirely. I do not wish for a different wife than the one sitting beside me now. I only wish for the version of her that no longer believes she must hide to be safe. It was not a cure, not a sudden erasure of years of careful survival. But it was a beginning, a foundation laid stone by careful stone, between two people who had entered their marriage as strangers bound by obligation, and who now found themselves, slowly and against every expectation, becoming something far more valuable than either had imagined possible. The fear did not vanish overnight, but for the first time in longer than Adelina could remember, she began to believe that perhaps, in this house, with this man, she might finally be permitted to stop being afraid. The Dowager Duchess arrived at Camden House on a gray morning in early spring, unannounced except for a brief note sent ahead by messenger the previous evening, giving the household barely enough time to prepare a proper welcome. Julian's mother, Lady Constance, had never been a woman who valued advance warning when she believed her presence carried enough weight to excuse any inconvenience. Adelina had met her mother-in-law only once before, briefly, at the wedding itself, where Constance had offered a cool, appraising glance and little else. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that their paths might not cross often, given the distance between Camden House and the Dowager's own estate. That hope proved short-lived. "You look thin," Constance observed within the first 5 minutes of her arrival, studying Adelina with the same critical eye she might apply to a horse she was considering purchasing. "And pale. Are you certain the marriage has agreed with you?" "I am quite well, thank you," Adelina replied, keeping her voice level despite the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever she found herself the subject of close scrutiny. Constance's gaze lingered a moment longer before shifting to her son. "Julian, might I speak with you privately?" Adelina excused herself gracefully, retreating toward the library, while mother and son disappeared into the study. But she did not miss the sharp edge in Constance's tone, nor the way her eyes had tracked toward Adelina's gloved hands with obvious curiosity. Behind the closed study door, Constance wasted no time. "The household staff speak of strange habits," she said without preamble. "Gloves indoors, long sleeves in the warmth of summer. A wife who flinches at unexpected touches like a nervous colt. Julian, what exactly have you married into?" "A woman who deserves far more respect than you are currently offering her," Julian replied, his voice cool but firm. "I am simply concerned for the family name," Constance pressed. "An heir requires a wife capable of fulfilling her duties, not one so fragile she cannot bear the touch of her own husband." "There are whispers already, Julian. People are beginning to ask questions." "Let them ask," Julian said. "I will not have my wife's private struggles become fodder for society gossip, and I will not have you speaking of her as though she were a broodmare being evaluated for breeding stock." Constance's expression tightened at the sharpness in his tone, unaccustomed to such direct opposition from her son. "I only wish to see this family secured, Julian. Your father's line depends on it." "My father's line depends on nothing more urgent than my own happiness and my wife's well-being," Julian replied. "And I would ask, Mother, that you remember whose house you are currently a guest in." The conversation ended there, though the tension it created lingered through the following days, like smoke that refused to clear. Constance remained at Camden House for nearly a week, and though she made no further direct comments about Adelina's habits, her pointed observations continued in subtler forms. Comments about the importance of a proper heir, remarks about young women who allowed nervous dispositions to interfere with marital duty, all delivered with the practiced skill of a woman who knew precisely how to wound without ever raising her voice. Adelina bore it as best she could, retreating into the same careful smallness that had once protected her within her father's household. But something had changed in her since the wedding. Some small foundation of confidence built through weeks of Julian's patience, and she found herself, for the first time, unwilling to simply absorb the cruelty without response. It happened during dinner on the 4th evening of Constance's visit. The Dowager had made some passing comment about delicate constitutions being unsuited to the demands of running a great household, her eyes flicking meaningfully toward Adelina as she spoke, and something in Adelina finally, quietly, refused to fold beneath the weight of it. "I have found," Adelina said, her voice steady and clear across the table, "that a household runs rather well when its mistress is permitted to manage it according to her own judgment, rather than spending her energy defending herself against unfounded criticism at every meal. Silence fell over the table. Constance's eyebrows rose sharply, clearly unaccustomed to being addressed with such directness by a young woman she had assumed would remain quietly compliant. Julian, seated at the head of the table, said nothing for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch. Then, quietly, he reached over and covered Adelina's gloved hand with his own, a small gesture of support, offered in full view of his mother. "My wife manages this household beautifully," he said. "I would ask that you extend her the courtesy her position deserves, Mother, or find your visits here considerably shortened in the future." Constance's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further on the matter, and the remainder of the meal passed in careful, strained politeness. It was not a resolution, not entirely, but it marked a shift Adelina had not expected to witness so soon, the sight of her husband choosing her openly, without hesitation, over the approval of his own mother. Later that evening, after Constance had retired for the night, Adelina found Julian in the garden, walking the paths beneath a sky scattered with early stars. "Thank you," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him, "for what you said at dinner." "You needed no defending," Julian replied. "You handled yourself admirably. I merely made certain my mother understood where my loyalties reside." Adelina looked at him for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest, and before she could think too carefully about the impulse, she reached out and took his hand in hers, gloved fingers wrapping around his without hesitation. It was a small gesture, ordinary to most couples, but for Adelina, it carried the weight of a mountain moved. Julian seemed to understand its significance immediately, going very still, careful not to break the moment with too sudden a reaction. "You do not have to wear the gloves with me," he said softly, after a long pause. "Not if you do not wish to. I have already seen what lies beneath them, and nothing about what I saw has changed how I feel toward you." Adelina's breath caught, and for a moment old fear rose sharp and immediate, the instinct to protect, to hide, to keep the vulnerable parts of herself locked safely away, where no one could use them against her. But looking at Julian now, standing patiently beside her in the quiet garden, offering nothing but steady acceptance, she found the fear loosening its grip, just slightly. Slowly, deliberately, she removed one glove, then the other, and stood before him, with her bare hands exposed to the cool evening air, the faint marks on her forearms visible in the moonlight for the first time since the night of the fire. Julian did not react with shock or pity, the reactions she had feared most. He simply took her hands gently in his own, turning them over with careful reverence, his thumb tracing lightly along the edge of one faded mark, before he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss against her wrist. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said quietly. Adelina felt tears gather, but they were not tears of fear this time. They were tears of something closer to relief, the particular relief that comes only after years spent believing a secret must be carried alone, only to discover it can finally be set down. In the weeks that followed, small changes rippled through their marriage, like ripples across still water. Adelina began wearing gloves less frequently, first only in Julian's presence, then gradually in the presence of trusted household staff, who had proven themselves discreet and kind. She began sleeping more easily, the nightmares that had plagued her since childhood, growing less frequent, as the safety of her new life slowly settled into her bones. Julian, for his part, learned the particular language of his wife's comfort, understanding, without needing to be told which forms of touch felt safe, and which still carried echoes of old harm. He asked, before reaching for her hand. He gave her space when she needed it, without taking the space as rejection. He learned, patiently and without complaint, the careful choreography of building trust with someone who had spent years learning that trust was dangerous. Their marriage, born of obligation and cold arrangement, had transformed slowly into something neither of them had expected to find. It was not without its difficulties. Constance's visits remained tense affairs, and letters from Adelina's father continued to arrive, with uncomfortable regularity, each one a reminder of the past she was working so hard to move beyond. But within the walls of Camden House, in the quiet moments shared between husband and wife, something genuine had taken root, something built not on duty or expectation, but on patience, honesty, and the slow, careful work of healing. Adelina began to laugh more freely, her wit sharpening into something she no longer felt the need to hide. She began to speak her opinions plainly at dinner, in the drawing room, in conversations with the household staff who had grown to genuinely admire their thoughtful, increasingly confident mistress. She began, in small but meaningful ways, to become the person she might have been all along, had circumstances been kinder. And Julian, watching this transformation unfold before him, found himself falling in love with his wife, not despite her past, but through the courage it took her to move beyond it, one careful step at a time. Yet even as their bond deepened, a shadow remained on the horizon. Adelina's father had not given up on the idea of reconciling the families, and Lavinia, it seemed, had grown curious about the daughter she had once controlled so completely, now living a life of unexpected happiness beyond her reach. A final confrontation was coming, one neither Adelina nor Julian could avoid forever, and both of them understood that the fragile peace they had built would soon be tested by the very past Adelina had worked so hard to leave behind. The carriage bearing Adelina's father and stepmother arrived at Camden House on a bright morning in late spring, despite Julian's earlier letter declining the visit. A second letter had followed weeks later, this one from Lavinia herself, insisting that family obligations could not be postponed indefinitely, and that propriety demanded a proper visit be paid, regardless of prior excuses. Adelina had known, deep down, that the reprieve would not last forever. Standing at the window of the drawing room as the carriage rolled up the long drive, she felt the old fear rising in her chest, familiar and suffocating, threatening to pull her back into the small, careful version of herself she had worked so hard to leave behind. Julian's hand found hers, steady and warm. "You do not have to face them alone," he said, "and you do not have to face them at all, if that is your wish. I can turn the carriage away at the gate." "No," Adelina said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "I have hidden from this long enough. I would rather face it now, with you beside me, than continue running from it for the rest of my life." The visit began with the same careful, false pleasantries Adelina remembered from years of practiced family gatherings. Her father, gray-haired and stooped in ways he had not been at the wedding, greeted her with an awkward, uncertain warmth, as though uncertain how his newly confident daughter fit into the timid image he had carried of her for so many years. Lavinia, elegant as ever in dark traveling silks, offered a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "You look well, Adelina," Lavinia said, studying her with the same critical assessment Adelina remembered from childhood. "Marriage clearly agrees with you." "It does," Adelina replied simply, refusing to offer the nervous deference Lavinia's tone seemed designed to provoke. Over the course of the afternoon, Lavinia's comments grew sharper, more pointed, the way they always had when Adelina failed to shrink appropriately beneath her attention. She made remarks about Adelina's forwardness at dinner, about opinions a proper young wife ought to keep private, about the strange rumors that had reached her own household regarding Adelina's peculiar habits with gloves and long sleeves. "I simply worry," Lavinia said, her voice dripping with false concern, as they sat together in the drawing room, Julian having briefly excused himself to attend to estate business. "You were always such a delicate child, prone to imaginative stories. I do hope you have not been troubling your husband with tales from your youth. Men do not always understand a young woman's tendency toward exaggeration." The words landed exactly as they were meant to, a careful warning disguised as concern, a reminder of years spent being told her own memories could not be trusted. But Adelina, sitting now in the home she had built with a man who had never once doubted her, found she no longer carried the same fear of Lavinia's careful manipulations. "My husband," Adelina said quietly, "has never once suggested I exaggerate anything. He has, in fact, been remarkably attentive to matters I once believed no one would ever care enough to notice." Lavinia's smile faltered, just slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her composed features. "I do not know what you mean to imply." "I believe you understand precisely what I mean," Adelina said, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her own heart. "I am no longer the frightened child you once controlled so completely, Lavinia. I have a household of my own now, a husband who values my voice, and I no longer feel obligated to protect your reputation by staying silent about what occurred in my father's house." The color drained from Lavinia's face. "You would not dare speak of such things publicly," Think of your father's position, the family name. I have thought of little else for most of my life, Adelina interrupted, and for the first time, her voice carried no tremor at all. I spent years thinking of everyone's comfort but my own, protecting a reputation, built on cruelty I was never permitted to name. I do not intend to make public accusations, Lavinia. That is not who I am. But I will no longer sit quietly while you suggest my memories are simply the exaggerations of an imaginative child. I remember everything, every single moment, and I have finally stopped believing I deserved any of it. Julian returned to the drawing room, in time to hear the final words, and though he said nothing, the quiet, steady pride in his expression, as he crossed to stand beside his wife, spoke volumes. Lavinia, flustered and clearly unaccustomed to such direct confrontation, made a hasty excuse about the lateness of the hour, and gathered her husband for an early departure. The visit cut shorter than originally planned. Adelina's father lingered a moment longer at the door, studying his daughter with an expression that seemed, for the first time in years, to hold something like genuine regret. I should have done more, he said quietly, so Lavinia would not hear. I have known for a long time that I failed you. I am sorry, Adelina, truly. Adelina looked at her father, feeling not the old ache of longing for his protection, but a quieter, more complicated sorrow for the relationship that might have been, had he found the courage sooner. Thank you for saying so, she said simply. I hope, in time, we might find a way forward, but it will take time, and it will require more from you than words alone. Her father nodded, accepting the boundary without argument, and climbed into the carriage beside his wife. Adelina watched from the drive as it rolled away down the long path, carrying with it the last remnants of the fear that had once ruled every corner of her life. Standing beside Julian, in the fading afternoon light, she felt something settle within her, a peace she had not known she was capable of feeling. You were extraordinary, Julian said softly, turning to face her fully. I did not think I would find the courage, Adelina admitted. But standing here, in this home, with you beside me, I found I no longer needed to be afraid of her. That evening, as the household settled into its familiar quiet rhythms, Julian led Adelina not to her own chamber, but to his, the room she had avoided since that first uncertain night, so many months before. He paused at the door, offering her the choice, as he always did, patient and unhurried. Only if you wish it, he said. There is no obligation here, Adelina. There never has been. Adelina looked at the man who had shown her, day by careful day, that safety and love could exist together, that vulnerability did not have to end in harm, that the marks she carried did not define her worth in his eyes, or her own. She thought of the frightened bride who had flinched away from his touch on their wedding night, and the woman she had become since, stronger, steadier, finally beginning to believe she deserved the gentleness she had been offered. I wish it, she said softly, and stepped through the door beside him, not out of obligation, not out of duty, owed to a contract signed by others on her behalf, but out of genuine, hard-won trust in the man who had waited, with endless patience, for her to arrive at this moment, on her own terms. What followed was not the cold transaction either of them had once expected from their arranged marriage, but something far more tender, built on months of careful understanding, of boundaries respected, and trust slowly earned. Julian's touch remained gentle, attentive to every small signal, pausing whenever hesitation flickered across her features, and Adelina found herself, for the first time in her life, fully present in her own body, without the shadow of old fear pressing at the edges of the moment. In the months that followed, Camden House became known throughout the county, not for whispered rumors about its unusual duchess, but for the evident warmth between the Duke and his wife, a partnership that surprised the very society members who had once predicted a cold, dutiful arrangement at best. Adelina took on the management of the estate's charitable works, finding purpose in supporting young women and children who had faced hardships she understood all too well. Julian stood beside her at every function, every gathering, his pride in his wife evident to anyone who cared to look. Constance, in time, softened toward her daughter-in-law, won over gradually, by Adelina's evident capability and the genuine happiness so clearly visible in her son. Even Adelina's father made small, tentative efforts toward reconciliation, though the relationship between them remained forever changed by years of silence he could not fully undo. But it was in the quiet moments, away from society's watching eyes, that the true measure of their marriage could be found. In the garden at dusk, hands clasped without hesitation. In the library, heads bent together over shared books. In the simple, ordinary comfort of a marriage that had begun as cold obligation and had grown, through patience and honesty and the slow rebuilding of broken trust, into something neither of them had dared to hope for on that first uncertain wedding night. The marks beneath her sleeves remained, faint reminders of a past she could not erase, but they no longer defined her. She had become, in the safety of a home, built on genuine love, something far greater than the sum of her old wounds. She had become, at last, entirely herself.